Welcome back. In the previous video, we motivated why you would want to experiment a lot with generative AI and become an effective user of generative AI. And in this video, we'll run through some examples and techniques to get you started. So one thing it's very important that you know as a user of generative AI and in general, but also as a software developer, software engineer, is that there are multiple levels in which you can use generative AI systems. And now let's talk about large language models. You can use them on different levels. So level 0 is to use the chatbot or large language model as if it was a person. And that is not a good idea, and no one should be at this level. It is not a person. You should incorporate your knowledge about what this thing is in how you use it, and it will perform much better. But unfortunately, many people are stuck on level 0. So everyone should at least be at level 1, where you tailor your interactions with the system and these models underlying these systems according to your understanding of what kinds of objects they are. And there are deeper levels, and we'll get to those as well, but these are for later, and we'll start out by trying our hand on some level 1 stuff. So be warned that prompting is more an art than a science. It has to do with the fact that nobody really knows exactly how to make these systems behave optimally. So it's more an art than a science, and that means you have to experiment a lot. Note also that when you use these systems via web applications, that you don't share any sensitive or protected information, because the terms of service typically allow the web app operators to use the data you enter. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's think about associations again. So we know that these LLMs are some kind of association machines. So one thing they're particularly good at is to link concepts and ideas together. For example, we can ask it to identify and describe connections between concepts and ideas. So for example, is there a connection between psychological safety in the workplace and the organization's ability to quickly adapt to market changes? So I took two different ideas, and I asked it to sort of talk about those and give me some examples. And of course it will answer, and if you look at these points it raises, of course it understood what I was after, and it comes up with some examples that make sense. So let's try another one. Maybe we are interested in the connection between the emotional intelligence of employees and an organization's ability to manage risk. Okay, so if you think about it a little bit, then of course you could come up with connections yourself, but you could also get some ideas from ChatGPT, and it comes up with some reasonable ideas, some connections between these two things. So here, you notice that the kinds of responses ChatGPT gave were maybe different from what you experienced before, and that's because I'm using system messages, some custom instructions, and that defines the system's behavior. So we'll look at that later. Is there a connection between code quality and a team's ability to handle stress? If yes, give me 5 examples. And okay, it finds out some connections, or it tries to understand what you're after, and then finds some connections and examples. That again, it makes sense. And let's try another one. Does the development methodology, such as Agile, Scrum, or Waterfall, affect an organization's ability to scale? If yes, give me 5 examples. Okay, and it does this step-by-step thinking because I instructed it to behave like that in my custom instructions, my system message, and then comes up again with examples, and again, they make sense. So I have one more like vague, what we're after. Use or apply the concept of time and its finitude to discuss innovation within software consulting firms. Okay, so then it understands more or less what I'm after, and it comes up with some ideas for how this concept can be applied. And always remember that if you don't like these ideas or if you want to explore them further, you can of course continue the conversation. It's important to not forget that these are chatbots. So these system messages again, these are instructions that you give the models where you define its behavior. So this is part of prompt engineering, and the principles for how to write a reasonable or good system messages is also part of prompt engineering, but it's slightly different from just being the prompt. So these models are tuned to follow the system messages more to a greater extent than they follow the prompt. So you should think about what you write here. This is from ChatGPT. You should think of this as defining the behavior of your bot now. So you're changing the behavior of the bot by changing the custom instruction, and then you can use it as before, and it will then follow this, have this behavior. And once you start using ChatGPT and those kind of systems more and more, you get used to formulating these kind of system messages, and typically you tend to change them almost every time you use ChatGPT. You tailor your system message to get the behavior you want. So again, this is part of prompt engineering. So you should experiment. So here's another example. In this one, I use OpenAI's Playground, a solution where you can tweak or modify the settings for the models to a greater extent. So it's a very useful place to experiment with the GPT models. And the goal in this example is to create a system that is that tries to improve the user's skill at reflective thought. So I was inspired here by the writing and thinking of John Dewey, who stressed the difference between things you believe without any solid reason behind your belief and things you believe where you can sort of trace the grounds for your belief back through multiple steps. Meaning beliefs where you can whose support you can articulate. Right. Okay, so I define the system behavior by extracting some pieces from Dewey's work, and you see here I put in the point that there are different kinds of beliefs, and I asked the chatbot to have this behavior of helping the user dig into their beliefs and use the Socratic method and so on. Okay, and then the user or the student enters some message that contains some sort of belief, and then the job of the assistant or the artificial professor Dewey is to help the user explore the reasons for their beliefs and perhaps then strengthen or help them update their beliefs, right? Okay, so this is one example of AI used for education, and that's an area that I'm very much focused on these days, because here there's a lot of potential for AI. So let's go to another example. Educational use of AI still, role play. Since the AI knows about the writings and the sort of styles of famous people, and since you can always just tell it about the writings and style of famous people or other people, non-famous, you can construct these kind of role play systems. So in this case, so now I'm talking to the former Norwegian Prime Minister and about education at elementary schools in Norway, and then I get a response that is sort of in line with what she has written and her thinking. And then you can also ask for arguments for and against things, and that's not a common thing to hear from the politicians, right? They are them arguing both for and against the same position, but here it's possible. So it's a way to explore the thoughts of various thinkers, so to get different perspectives on topics, even about subjects that these people have never considered. And by the way, creating such AI-powered tools is part of modern software engineering a modern software engineer's toolkit. So a software engineer already knows a lot about how to construct software, so it's easy then to construct sort of this interface to the model, or the thing that packages the model at the heart of this, and therefore to build software on top of AI. So we'll talk more about that later. So from these examples, it's clear that anyone working with ideas can benefit from AI. So here's another example. I give ChatGPT a text and I ask it to adapt the text to different audiences. So in this case, I have a text I took from my university's website about the university, and I want it, or I'm grabbing it here. This is the text I'm grabbing, just pasting it in, and I want the ChatGPT to tailor this text for three different groups: for prospective students, for potential collaborators from industry, and for potential research collaborators. Okay, so it has some information, and it's then trying to adapt the information for different audiences. And you see it's doing that, right? And we can, of course, continue this iteratively with the chatbot. It can also browse the web, so we can also point it to some URL where there's more information. For example, I have a URL here where it contains information tailored maybe to industry collaborators, and I ask it to pull information from that and then update the text for potential industry collaborators by also including information it found on that website. So this is possible. And by the way, here's one thing that's useful to know, is that these systems, these LLMs, these large language models, are actually better at processing and collaborating on text than generating from scratch. So the word, or the name generative AI, is a little bit misleading, or at least it leads some people to think that the strength of these models is like generate stuff from scratch. Like ask it to write a 1,500-word essay about the causes of the French Revolution, and so on, right? You can do it. It will generate an essay on the French Revolution, but the real strength in these systems lies in collaborating on text with you. So they can suggest improvements, additions, and more to existing text. And that's where you will get the real power. So they are more like collaborators than just generators. So from this and similar examples, it's clear that anyone working with text can benefit from large language models. Also, with modern tools, AI tools for speech recognition and speech synthesis, you can enable LLM chatbots to both listen and speak. And by doing so, you get an inkling of the voice assistants of the future. So let's try it out. Give me some constructive feedback to the following. With modern AI tools for speech recognition and speech synthesis, one can enable LLM chatbots to both listen and speak, giving us an inkling of the voice assistants of the future.
Here is some constructive feedback to your text. Your text is clear and concise, and it introduces an interesting idea of using AI tools for speech recognition and synthesis to create voice-enabled chatbots. However, your text could be improved by providing some more details and examples of how these AI tools work and what benefits they offer for the users and the developers of chatbots. For instance, you could explain how speech recognition and synthesis models are trained and evaluated, and what challenges they face in terms of accuracy, naturalness, and diversity. You could also mention some existing applications or projects that use these AI tools, and how they enhance the user experience and the functionality of chatbots.
Thanks. So how would you tell this story?
You're welcome. If I were to tell this story, I would write something like this. Voice assistance is a rapidly growing field that aims to provide natural and intuitive interactions between humans and machines. One of the ways.
So it wasn't super happy about my introduction to that topic, and maybe I should let AI do the job that I'm just now doing. But at least it's clear that anyone working with speech can benefit from modern AI. So what else? Well, let's try to give ChatGPT the role of a programmer. So again, now I use these custom instructions, these system messages, and I turn its behavior into becoming a programmer, and I turn on what OpenAI calls advanced data analysis, meaning now it can do programming, execute programs in Python. And I give it some data. So here I give it the diabetes data set that you've seen many times before, and then we can explore this data together with ChatGPT. So first I ask for some basics about the data. So it has a plan now. It's going to check a few rows and see what the data looks like. And you see it actually writing Python code, and not only writing Python code, but also executing the code. So by executing it figures out what the names of the columns are, and it guesses what they mean, and it proposes that we should look into the statistical properties of the data, and I just say, yes, that's a good idea. And it figures out more about the data, some summary statistics. And looking at this summary statistics, you may realize that even if the bot is saying there's no missing values, well, there's a lot of zeros, or there are zeros in the data. And a zero BMI doesn't make sense, for example. So I ask it, what do you think about the zero values in the columns? Could they indicate missing data? Okay, or missing values in columns. So it thinks that was an excellent observation, and it understands that, yeah, you can't have zero glucose level. That's not medically plausible. And it has some ideas of how we can fix it. And I just say, yes, identify the number of zeros to see how big is the problem. It counts the number of zeros in each column, and understands or derives some implications from this sometimes very large number of zeros. And then has some ideas of how to proceed by imputing, so like putting in values for these missing values. Something we need when we later train machine learning models on this. Okay, so I want to replace the missing values. What does ChatGPT think is best for this? Should I replace, for example, by the median or the mean? Well, there are some pros and cons to each one, and it has some idea for this data what we should do. I just go for that idea. Why not? And now it's imputing values. Okay, so we can continue. The next typical step could perhaps be we want some further visual explorations of the data. We need to visualize the different features in the data, and to get a better understanding of the problem we're trying to solve. And okay, so it can do that. It has some ideas of some plots it can use, and starts plotting. And again, it's executing the code, so it's actually producing the plots and then showing the plots to us, right? So here are some histograms for each feature, and okay, that's useful. And you start interpreting those histograms, like is it long tails or whatever, and ChatGPT is doing that for us. And then it wants to look at box plots to identify outliers. Well, why not? Let's try to do that. And okay, so you see there's a bunch of outliers for certain features, like the insulin. And should we look then at maybe, so we understand that there are outliers, and then it suggests that we look at the relationship between the different features by looking at the pairwise correlations. Makes sense. So I just say yes, and there's a pairwise correlation, like a heat map of the pairwise correlations, and it's analyzing then the correlation strengths and make some conclusions for that. And let's say I'm very interested in the relationship between glucose and diabetes, and I want to explore that in great detail. And I can ask it to then use multiple approaches to do that. Okay, so it suggests scatter plots, box plots, Bayesian plots, density plots. We could ask for more, of course, but let's just do those. So again, it's writing Python code and then showing it. Okay, so here's a scatter plot for this diabetes case, where you either have diabetes or not. I wasn't very happy about that plot because the diabetes is a categorical variable, and so this doesn't tell us that much, or it wasn't that informative, and okay, it figures that out. So let's make the other plots, for example the box plot, and yeah, we can continue like this, exploring the data. So of course all of you have done this by hand, so you've written this kind of Python code, right, exploring even this same data set, so you understand what is needed to do it. But you also see that, okay, what is needed is typically very standard approaches. That's how you do the basics in machine learning. You follow some standard procedures, and these are encoded in the learning of ChatGPT, so it can do these standard things. So let's see. We can move a bit forward. You see, it's exploring many different things, and then making some new features, so feature engineering, and then we start training some models. It suggests some models and trains them. Okay, so let's see, after a bit we explore multiple different models, and we get some indication of performance. And let's say we're most interested in the random forest, and we wanted to finalize this random forest. And not only that, we want to construct a prototype application, web app, using Gradio for interacting with the model, which is a useful thing to do to get a better sense of how the model works or makes its predictions. And then, okay, so that is sort of the final step of this basic model development cycle. Finalize the model, deploy the model in a simple web app or similar, where users can start interacting with it. So we did everything by just prompting ChatGPT. So this is something you should definitely play with yourself. So let's do one more example of data analysis. So in this example, I give ChatGPT a PDF. It can read PDFs via plugins containing a job advertisement and a set of applicants or application letters for that job. Okay, and then of course the job of us evaluating job applications is to sort of get a sense of the different applicants. There can be very many, and then start to have some preliminary ranking of the applicants. And this is something that ChatGPT can support us in doing. Of course, there can be many pitfalls here, but at least this works, right? So it's extracted information from the PDF that contained the job announcement and the applicant's text, and it's ranking them according to the criteria specified in the job announcement. And it's figuring out that some are qualified, clearly qualified, and a few are actually not qualified because they don't actually have the minimum requirements. For example, this is a job announcement for becoming an associate professor, so you need to have a PhD, and some of them didn't have a PhD, so they are ranked low. So this is automatic. This is not the order in which the letters were in the PDF. This is ChatGPT's analysis of the applicants, and then the ChatGPT ranking. Okay, and then you can explore this further, right? And maybe you want some reasoning for why number 2 can perhaps be a good candidate, and here's a bunch of reasons. And then at the end, you can ask ChatGPT to give you a CSV file, say, that you can export into Excel, and then continue working. Okay, so anyone working with data can benefit from this kind of AI. So let's end this with a cool technique that you can use for basically anything you'd like generative AI to do. We already used it a little bit earlier. And the idea comes from this nice blog post by Azim Azar, so you can check it out there. So let's say you have an objective, something you'd like to explore. In this case, my objective is to understand how software is eating the world and what that means for current software engineering students. We know that ChatGPT can help us explore these kind of things. We can just ask it, right? But writing good prompts to have it perform well can be tricky. So here's a way to construct good prompts using ChatGPT. So first I ask it to give me 10 different prompts that can help me achieve this objective, and the outputs it thinks will be generated from those prompts. And then I ask it to evaluate each of them and score them on a scale from 0 to 100 according to some criteria that make sense, like the relevance to software engineers, their concreteness of the prompt, their clarity. And look, now it's generating 10 different prompts, and the output it sort of guesses would come from that prompt, and it's evaluating them, each of them, scoring them. So you see the scores vary based on what the ChatGPT thinks, how well the ChatGPT thinks it did the job in some sense. Okay, so then comes the next step, importantly. Based on this is information for ChatGPT. Make 3 prompts and produce their outputs, aiming to maximize the score on all 3 criteria. Okay, so now it knows what we just had above, the 10 prompts, and it knows their score. So this is kind of training data, like a few-shot learning, training data in the prompt that it can use. So now it comes up with better prompts, so it claims. So let's try one. So this is one prompt ChatGPT came up with that will give us, that it says is relevant for software engineering students, is concrete and clear. And it's not too bad. So it's not necessarily that easy to write prompts that end up with responses that are this good, and ChatGPT can help. So this is like a tool you should have in your toolbox. Get ChatGPT to help you with prompting. So with all these examples, we're of course just scratching the surface of what's possible. And we'll look at more examples later, then more program related. Because the next step in the next video, we'll start looking at how we can use LLMs as code companions, as tools that can help us become more efficient developers and software engineers. So see you in the next video.